I know what you're thinking, that is a seriously cool hat. Probably out of your budget though, and with good reason. It is no ordinary hat. It's monitoring and recording blood flow in my brain while I'm doing a fitness test. The reason for it is to demonstrate that cycling has an effect on how our brains actually function as well as our bodies. And that means that as well as being enjoyable, although not perhaps this exact bit, riding can also be a powerful tool to combat the stresses of modern life. We've come up to Oxford University, which has been at the forefront of mental health research for many, many years. And recently they've been looking into the effect of exercise on mental health. And in doing so, they discovered that cyclists suffer, on average, 21.6% fewer days of poor mental health on any given month compared to people who didn't exercise. And in fact, cycling was second only to team sports in its effectiveness in this regard. So, to find out a little bit more about this and get some much needed practical advice on how we can use cycling to improve our own mental health, we've come up to meet the author of that research and some of his colleagues. Before we do though, I think we should go back a step. I began by talking about stress, but the research talks about mental health. So what actually distinguishes the two? Well, not very much. They're all interlinked. Stress is very common. Many of us are familiar with it, I'm sure. It's our body's way of dealing with situations it perceives as threatening. You get a release of certain hormones, which then trigger a response from our cardiovascular, our respiratory, and our nervous systems. It makes you hyper alert, ready to fight, and very useful in small doses. But elevated stress levels over medium to long term can have really negative consequences on our physical health, not to mention the repercussions on our mental health. It can lead to depression and anxiety. A lot of us perhaps are unfamiliar with the symptoms of those, but when you hear the list, might actually sound quite familiar. You might feel sad or empty. You might feel irritable or hopeless, angry. You might have lost interest in your work or family or hobbies. You might struggle to concentrate. You might be feeling overwhelmingly tired, but yet still struggle to sleep. And it might change your eating habits as well, either causing you to overeat or indeed not eat at all. Now, I'll be really honest, and I was surprised when I recognised myself in that list. I mean, I consider myself a very happy person, but yet clearly on reflection, there have been times in my life when I've undergone some kind of mental health event. Now, I'm not alone in that, not by a long shot. 1 in 4 people will have experienced mental health issues in the last year. 1 in 6 people in any given week. Now, in severe cases, of course, some kind of long-term treatment will be needed, whether that's psychological therapies or indeed medication. But yet, as we saw from those initial statistics from Sami Chekrud's research, physical exercise can have a really positive effect both in treatment and prevention, and with cycling right at the top of that list. How though? Well, here we are, back where we started. Although we have changed universities, this is the Human Performance Centre at Oxford Brookes, which is very conveniently just down the road. And the scientists here are kindly about to put me through my paces whilst wearing this, which is not a novelty hat, but actually an infrared imaging system called near-infrared spectroscopy. And what it's going to do is show changes in blood flow to different areas of my brain, meaning that we should be able to see in real time how that changes as I start to ride. As well as monitoring the blood flow in my brain, I also, as you can see, have a mask on to collect expired gases to give the team a clear indication of how hard I'm trying. In addition to my heart rate, which is being recorded, as well as my power being measured by the elite trainer. The test begins with riding at 150 watts for 4 minutes before getting back to a baseline, then 4 minutes at 250 watts, then recovery before a final 4 minutes at nearly VO2 max, so about 425 watts. 3 really distinct intensities to hopefully provide a snapshot of how it relates to brain function.
So we've got the system on your head, and it's measuring change in blood flow in the front of your brain. So what we can see on the screen is change in activity in terms of change in amount of hemoglobin as reflective of change in blood flow. Okay. So hopefully showing a change in activity in those areas. So what we do is wait here now until your heart rate comes back down to what it was at resting.
Okay.
So plus or minus 10%.
Cool.
Okay, so we'll just keep you sat there. Are you happy to keep this going?
Yeah.
Okay, because you're working hard.
Yeah. Okay, how would you rate your breathlessness? 18. 18, and how hard you're working? Right now? As you were at the end of the stage just there. Okay, 18. 18.
I'm not going to lie, I was quite glad to get that one over with. Although I will just say, actually, it probably wasn't quite as bad as it looked. Well, as you can see, the hat is gone, but instead we're armed with some quite incredible data. It's taken a lot of hard work to get to this point. And to talk us through it, we've got Professor John Geddes, who's the head of psychiatry at Oxford University, which is adjacent to Oxford Brookes, where we are now. Is there anything that we can actually see then from this data that shows that my brain starts to work differently as I'm cycling harder?
Yeah, there is. We can sort of look at the results of the scan, and we were looking particularly at your frontal lobes. So we're looking at the areas of the brain that are particularly involved in decision making, if you like, the control center of the brain. So it's looking at decision making, the initiation of and maintaining goal-directed activity, and some of the kind of emotional processing that happens in the brain too. And we can see some differences, even though it's just you, and there's obviously lots of limitations to looking at one person. And the way we did the experiment didn't allow for warm-up. But nonetheless, it indicates that the way that the frontal lobe is activated at different levels of intensity of exercise do differ in your case.
The data that Professor Geddes is referring to can be overlaid on a diagram of my brain. Each circle represents the approximate location of one of the infrared light sensors. The shaded areas show the parts of my brain where those sensors detected a decrease in oxygenated blood as I rode harder, and then now where there was a corresponding increase. The theory then is that an increase in blood supply would follow an increase in activity.
Well, what we can see is that depending on the effort, so whether you're going at the 50% effort or the 90% effort, so I think that was 420 watts.
Something like that, I think, yeah.
Kicking out over, which obviously takes some degree of maintaining, then the area of the brain that is focusing on maintaining that kind of goal increases as you go to the higher level of effort.
Okay.
So we can't actually map the brain activity onto real understanding of exactly what processes are involved. At this point, it's more being able to detect that there are differences in this really key part of the brain depending on the effort. So the implication of that is if you have to put more attention and concentration on maintaining that goal, then it will involve in activation of different parts of the frontal lobe.
Okay, so there's a greater activity on my sort of goal-focused part of my brain. What then would that be at the expense of, like what part of my brain is potentially getting less oxygenated blood?
Well, from this we can't see that, but on the ratings there are other areas of the frontal lobe that might be doing less. So it might be by putting more focus and attention into the goal-directed parts of the brain, you may be removing some of the effort from other parts. But from the basis of this experiment, we couldn't really say exactly what activities you're under investing in at that point.
Okay.
But there's only so much blood going around the brain at any point. So clearly, by focusing more on one particular area, you're going to be freeing up other areas.
Okay.
That's about as far as we can go with this one.
Well, I mean, purely subjectively, it's fascinating because I find personally that when I ride, if I'm riding gently, then my sort of internal monologue, my hamster wheel is going non-stop. But the harder I ride, the less I think about stuff and the more I'm just sort of in the moment and riding, which is why I probably tend to ride everywhere as fast as I can, because that for me is my relaxation. And so does that kind of tally up then with what we've seen on this data?
Well, I think it does. I think it's really fascinating, isn't it? Because we know that the way that we engage with thinking can have quite substantial effects on our sense of well-being, relaxation. I mean, it underlies some of the other kind of therapies that we've got, things like mindfulness, where one changes the way you're interacting with the external world and the way that you're focusing on things. So I think it could well be not an explanation, but I think it could fit in with that subjective sense that you have, that by putting more effort into meeting a particular goal in cycling, then you find that more relaxing.
Yeah. So
it is interesting.
It is fascinating. The good news, I guess, then, is that, you know, in the short term, there is a significant impact on the way my brain's functioning. The bad news is that, for me, mindfulness is 425 watts. Armed then with the knowledge that exercise clearly has an effect on brain function in the short term, we are now off to the psychiatry department of Oxford University to meet with Sami Chekrud. He's the author of that research we've already mentioned, very catchily titled Association Between Physical Exercise and Mental Health in 1.2 million Americans between 2011 and 2015. A cross-sectional study, looking now not at the short-term effects, but the medium and the long-term effects instead. So firstly then, how did you actually sample such a large group of people?
So basically every year, the Center for Disease Control in the United States deploys this thing called the Behavioral Risk Factors Surveillance Survey, where they literally call people up in the States from every state in America, and they have like this long list of questions where they get all kinds of information on people. And then every 2 years, they also collect information about people's exercise behaviors. So how regularly people exercise on average, and when they do exercise, how long for, what the kind of intensity is, and what kind of exercise they primarily do. So that data is freely available just online. We downloaded the data and just kind of went from there.
So what do the stats actually tell us then about exercise and mental health?
So broadly, what we found is that there was a strong association between exercising and a worse mental health burden. So people were asked in the last month, how many bad days mental health did you have? So it's quite like all-encompassing, included things like stress, like mood. And we found that people who exercised and versus people who didn't were associated with about 40% fewer days bad mental health than people who didn't exercise. So it's quite a big effect. And then because we have information on the type of exercise that people do and how often people exercised and how long for, you can also look at specific features, like are some exercises better than others for mental health? Are some durations of exercise better than other durations? And are some frequencies better than others? And found this kind of like sweet spot where exercising for 3 to 5 times a week for about 45 minutes each time was associated with the best mental health outcome. And that once you look at the type of exercise, that cycling came in as number 2, just behind popular team sports, the kind of sports that you would like play at school. So things like football, rugby, hockey, that kind of thing. And then with aerobic and gym exercises coming in close behind in third.
Now, is it possible to tell from the data whether or not it's the exercise itself that helps to improve people's mental health, or whether actually people who exercise typically have intrinsically better mental health?
The study that we employed was what's called a cross-sectional study. So we basically take a camera and take a big snapshot of a large group of people at one time point. And what that means is because you don't track people over time and you don't make people do certain things, you can't look specifically at causality. But what we can do is we can say at the level of a population, which has never really been done before, typically previous kind of more controlled studies will use sample sizes of somewhere between 50 and a couple of hundred. Instead, we have a really large sample and we can look more broadly at the association, and then further research is needed to look at the really fine-grained specifics of causality. But it's really hard to know because there's 2 quite intuitive things, which is if you feel bad and you then start exercising, that's something that you can control, and there's definitely like an aspect of taking ownership of your mood, and that can then help you, and exercise is one way of doing that. But also if you suffer from low mood or stress, you're less likely to exercise, which can then end up having this kind of spiral. with your mood as well. So it's likely that it is bidirectional, and other research has suggested that it is probably bidirectional, but it's really hard to tease apart.
Now, if you type exercise and mental health into Google, your research is everywhere. The mainstream media picked up on it, left, right and centre. Now, to me, I kind of thought, well, clearly it's a big story. Mental health is a big story, but also it suggested to me that perhaps people were surprised by the results that you got. Were you surprised, or did you kind of anticipate that this would be the outcome?
So the media kind of pick up on these things because they're kind of like gimmicks and phases, but it's also because it's really accessible. Like, people exercise, and it's really well known that exercise boosts your physical health. Like, you feel fitter, you feel better, you can see the effects on your body. But the kind of effects on your mental health are maybe a little bit less well known. Because previous research has been on quite small samples, even if it's been more controlled, it's hard to know how well it generalizes. So looking at such a large scale, you actually can't really make any intuition as to whether it's going to remain as an effect, whether it will kind of be obliterated, or even about the size of it. It could have turned out to be a really small effect at the level of the population, but actually it seemed to hold, at least in our study.
Now, as a cycling nerd, well, first of all, I was particularly pleased to see that cycling comes out at number 2, but also there's so many different types of cycling. Even just in my own, hobby, I ride on road and I ride off road and I ride indoors and I ride outdoors, and I ride on my own and with groups. Can you look at the data in a more granular way, specific to certain sports?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So on the basis of our study, because it is quite large, and some of the information is self-reported in it, which means that looking at very specifics is quite hard. But cycling is this really interesting sport where if you want, you can go alone. You can just kind of like cycle on roads, you can cycle off roads on your own. You can join a cycling club where you also get this kind of sociality effect of it by being part of a group, having kind of common goals on rides and things like that. It can have more psychological benefits as well. So there's definitely this kind of situation in cycling more so than in other sports like football, for example, where you can be part of a team or you can ride solo depending on what you feel at any moment. And then this kind of difference between indoor versus outdoor. Most cyclists probably do both depending on the time of year, but you probably also have a preference. And it's hard to say from, on the back of at least our research, actually which is more beneficial. Because the cycling group that we had included people who kind of cycled outdoors and indoors, whether that was on a turbo trainer or in the gym as well. So for that, you need a bit more kind of precise measurement. So you need people to kind of tell you what it is that they do most.
It's perhaps not surprising that there is still so much to learn about mental health, given the sheer complexities of our brains. They contain about 100 billion cells. But as technology improves, new avenues begin to open up. While at Oxford, we experimented with some more fancy headgear, an EEG in this case. This time it's monitoring electrical activity in the brain as opposed to blood flow. It's portable, meaning that our human guinea pig, called Chris, was able to ride both indoors and out. One day, it could tell us how the two activities might have different effects on the brain. Yet despite the fact that there is a significant amount still to understand about the brain and mental health, there is much that we do know about ways to cope with stress, anxiety and depression. And so to give some advice, we're back with Professor John Geddes, a psychiatrist by profession, but also a bike rider. Are there any practical bits of advice that you could give us, perhaps to help us make more of our cycling with a view to helping our stress levels or our anxiety or just general mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing is to recognise that you are feeling depressed or anxious. It's people will often kind of just ignore it, drive on and try and bash through it, and that's not usually the right thing to do. The right thing to do is probably to reflect and work out what the causes are, whether you can identify them, and if you can't do that, then to reflect and think about what you might be able to do different. And obviously, if people think cycling is enjoyable for them, to try and look at what possible component it is about cycling that is helpful for them. For some people, it's the exercise and the cardiovascular exercise and the rewards they get from that and the increased fitness. That can have a very beneficial effect on the way we feel. For other people, it's different things entirely. It's such a rich activity. It can be riding with others. It gives you social inclusion, and that's a very useful thing to do if people are depressed. For other people, it's completely opposite. It's riding alone because they want space from other people. They want to be able to relax away from others. Some people, you know, it's the enjoyment about the manual fiddling around and nerdery of cycles that can be very pleasurable, and you know, it's a real reward thing, so that might be useful for some people. Of course, as it gets to a more severe stage, those things might not work so much, and we might then need to go and get medical or clinical help in general and get some different treatment. But we're talking about the stages that many people experience of mild depression, anxiety or stress, and that's where things like cycling can be hugely beneficial.
Now, you touched a moment ago on more serious mental illnesses. I guess for a lot of what you said, it's applicable to people with stress or anxiety or mild depression, but what about if you have slightly more severe depression? What's the steps that you would need to take?
If you like, depression and anxiety are on a continuum, so when it gets to a certain level, it starts having a fairly major effect on your ability to function, whether it be at work or in your relationships. And it's at that point that we tend to see it as a clinical disorder, and at that point it's appropriate to get additional help for it. And the sorts of treatments that are available for that vary between psychological therapies like cognitive behavior therapy or mindfulness-based therapy or antidepressant drug therapy. Again, it's difficult to know for the individual who is going to respond to what. We're not at the point of knowing how to recommend specific interventions. But as a general principle, for sort of mild to moderate, I would tend to go for the psychological or changing things, increasing the exercise. But when it gets to a certain stage of maybe moderate, then that's when most recommendations would be to at least consider antidepressant treatment as well.
Okay, but it would be, the first port of call would be to go to your GP or...
Yeah, it was certainly in the UK, then that would be that you know, your general practitioner would be to go to, or in you know, in other countries, whoever the family doctor is in general, and that's usually the right way in. You can seek help through counsellors or psychologists or other psychotherapists. One of the difficulties is that knowing who delivers what, and knowing again what the treatment is that they offer. Whereas at least if you go in through the established health service route, you will tend to get something that is more defined and more reliable.
Invaluable advice. Firstly, admit that there is a problem, then reflect on what it is that provides relief and do more of it. In the case of cycling, it could be one of many aspects, but we are all different, so undoubtedly it's going to require a little bit of self-analysis. For me, it's short, high-intensity rides, either on my own or with a close friend or two, on quiet roads or trails. As a defense against stress, this is as effective as anything I've found. I hope you found this video useful as well as informative. I, for one, have found it absolutely fascinating, so I would just like to say a big thank you to the staff at Oxford and Oxford Brookes universities for their help in making this video possible. Not least because I now feel like I have scientific proof to show that I do indeed need to ride my bike really hard, regularly, for the benefit of my mental health. Now, do make sure you get involved in the comments section down below, and if you'd like to watch another video that's on a topic very similar to this one, click just down there.